Welcome to Casual Conversation with Cullen O'Connor, and we're going to talk about some leadership related issues that might interest you. Cullen, thanks for joining me this morning. Appreciate it. Um, Real quickly, if you wouldn't mind, kind of give a brief introduction as to who you are and what you do.
Sure. Thanks, John. As you mentioned, my name is Cullen O'Connor. I am a mechanical engineer by trade. I've bounced around between government, private industry, and I'm currently a NASA contractor doing simulation engineering. Um, as part of all of this, I got really into uh, creativity and how people come up with innovation. And part of that developed into uh, how creativity and innovation can be kind of planned out and built in, which brought in a leadership element, um, which I'd been kind of looking at casually, really since my teenage years in Scouts. Um, so all of these three things kind of come together for me, and so that's really what I like to talk about and study in my free time, which led me to this interaction.
Well, it's interesting because for me, it might not be interesting for anybody else who's watching, but your story is one that's unique because I tell people all the time, leadership is not rocket science. But yet, here we are, where we have a rocket scientist and we're talking about leadership.
I mean, big programs take a lot of leadership and a lot of management to sort out. And, when, especially on something like NASA, where you've got to plan for innovations, we don't do easy things. We try to do the hard things. We try to push those boundaries. And so you have to lead the innovation on kind of a plan and schedule. And, it's all of those things kind of come together and it's hard to do.
Yeah, it is. And I personally, while I have said it's not rocket science, it's a lot harder than just showing up and doing drawings. The engineering side of rocket science is certainly a different skill set,
Mhm.
but I think that some of the basic foundations are still there because one action leads to another, and when you're a question you posed was, what does a leadership subsystem look like?
Mhm.
And your posts recently have got me really like juiced up because there's probably too much to talk about there for a post. Um,
Oh yeah.
at least for me, because I could write a book about what I think um, these systems look like. And I think you've gotten a lot of good interaction on there, so I'm glad that we've had this opportunity to talk. But it's what's the great thing about leadership is when done correctly, it could look like engineering. It could look like a well-designed system, but when not done correctly, and I would be really interested in, I've got some friends that work in the government, and they've got opinions about government leadership. Um, and one of the quotes that I'll share with you, and I'd be interested to know what you think about this, is years and years ago, I had asked a question about surrounding conspiracy theories. And this person who answered the question had worked in the government at that point for about 20 years and said, if you really believe in conspiracy theories, you're giving our government too much credit because they take planning, they take, process engineering. A true conspiracy theory takes first the ability to actually keep your mouth shut about it. Second, the
Mhm.
ability to bring the right people together who are smart enough to outsmart everybody else. So those two things alone and the government do not mix. And so I'd be curious on your thoughts on that.
I think those two things and people don't mix. Um, and certainly, an entity as big and as large as the government, uh, yeah, I don't. It requires too many people. It would require too much cover up. It's I've heard you can't keep a secret between two people. So, you know, by the time you start adding hundreds and the fact that most conspiracy theories that I've heard don't make physical sense anyway.
I agree. I think that everybody trusts that one person, and if even if I trust you, there's someone you trust, and then someone they trust, and it's impossible to keep a secret. Um, so another question that you asked was, how many leaders think they have enough training to talk about what leadership is? And that's the question that actually sparked my curiosity because obviously I talk about leadership a lot. And so I have an opinion on this. And I think that um, while I have taken college accredited classes at Kansas State University and other colleges surrounding leadership taught by amazing leaders, um, haven't always agreed with everything that they've said. In fact, the first question that ever really struck me as odd was, is a leader born or made? And of course, my initial scientific answer to that is both, because if you were never born, you can't be a leader. And obviously, that wasn't the literal question that they were asking. Um, but here's the way I look at this: is I think that any leader can talk about leadership. I think that you may not agree with them, and that's the great thing about leadership is there's not any standard one definition of what a leader looks like. I think that we have leaders at every level, and we have leaders in every organization, whether they're considered a good leader, a great leader, or a bad leader. I think that's subjective and up to the organization to determine. For example, in your organization, the standards of what a leader should be are probably a lot higher than necessarily in the retail sector. A lot of leaders in the retail sector, they're just looking to make sure that person can show up on time, show up every day, and balance a P&L. Um, there's not a lot of intricate schedules or logistics to keep up on. Um, and you're not trying to launch a rocket into space. So I think that yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I would suggest that the standards that define a leader at your level are probably a little bit higher than what the average everyday leader would expect.
Um, that's the entry skills are certainly higher, right? You're not going to get somebody at NASA who um, is a leader who hasn't been in the trenches to some extent uh, you know, engineering leaders will have been an engineer. Typically at NASA, there are some who migrated from like SpaceX or Blue Origin and stuff like that. So those other skills are, but I find those skills to be separate from leadership per se. So it's kind of conflating the two, I think, to say uh, it's necessarily a higher leadership bar. Um, we have different skills and different tools, obviously, to deal with it. But um, part of what I was getting at with that post is like at its core, what is leadership? If we're talking about leadership at a retail level and at a NASA level, we kind of assume that we're talking about the same thing to a certain level, right? It's still a base skill set. Um, and I agree, there are lots of different situations and different skills that don't transfer between. But if we're trying to kind of get at the core of what leadership is, uh, we should have a skill. We should have a vocabulary to talk about that. And that's where like when I've asked a lot of leaders again in public and private sectors, hey, what does that look like? What is your model of leadership? What are your ideas about it? A lot of them can't give me that type of, what's their definition? They don't tend to have one. I get a lot of, uh, at least in the spaces that I've been, I get a lot of, well, I'm a servant leader. They don't really know what that means. It sounds good, or it sounded good to them at one point, and so they went with it. but it's not a robust model. It's not a robust vocabulary. And how do you mentor somebody if you don't have the words to talk about and say, hey, this is what it is? Um, it also tends to lead it to being conflated with just management. Um, and I see those as two completely separate things. Um, they're intertwined. You're never going to get a management position without some leadership responsibilities, but they are separate things. The way I generally say it is, management would be making the trains run on time, and leadership is where should that train go. Uh, and so, again, if you don't have this type of vocabulary, if you don't have an understanding of the models, um, then you're just trying to figure it out. You're reinventing the wheel, and there's been a lot of good, you know, thought on this and rigorous studies on this, and yet, you know, we don't spend the time to actually train our leaders into how to talk about what leadership is.
So the train uh, concept, how I would define that is I don't even know that the leader would decide where the train is going to go. I think the leader decides that, or the leader is the one who inspires the train to go. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I can generally agree with that. It's, I mean, all analogies fall apart at some point.
Mm. Yeah,
Um, but
and to
yeah,
me, I
leadership
guess,
is about vision. It's about
right.
what are we trying to do? What's the common goal? Rallying people, calling people in, marshaling resources to get this done.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And so there's a few things you said that I think are absolutely spot on and way overplayed. The manager versus leader um, analogy, there's, yeah, what I have tried to do when I teach this, and I ask young leaders coming up, are you a leader or are you a manager? And then what I ask them to do is let's break this down by the task and determine whether you're managing the task or you're leading the task. And if you are managing the task and under manager, whatever titles fit, supervisor, whatever, I don't care. It's managing. If you are physically touching something and doing something, you are managing that. But if you are getting something done through your motivation, through your inspiration, through your guidance, through your coaching, you are leading. And specifically, if you and I have a relationship, Cullen, and um, you go from this level 1 to this level 4 while we're working together, then I'm a leader because I helped your career along. And and I will point this out, and this is a controversial subject. I could be the worst leader or the best leader, and I can still help your career. And people don't want to admit that, but I can give you a long list of bad leaders that have taught me amazing things because I've watched what they do and I've said, there's no way I'm doing that.
Yeah,
And because I did the opposite of what they did, it enabled me to move on. Now, we could break that down into more of a philosophical conversation to say, well, was that leader truly a leader or were they just a manager in the wrong position? You know, I think that there are some people who have been horrible leaders for me, who have been amazing leaders for somebody else. And I think a lot of defining what leadership is subjective. And it does come down to what is it that you actually need right now in your life? Because I'm in logistics. And so if I've got somebody who walks in the door and they are an artist, maybe they're a sculptor, I am probably not going to be a leader for that person. I'm not going to be the leader that person needs right now. Now, from an integrity perspective, an ethical perspective, sure, I can model the behavior for how a person should act towards other humans, but there's no way that I'm going to help that person advance their career in sculpting unless I can teach them some disciplines of time management or whatever. But it's probably going to be unlikely that I'm going to have that kind of an impact. So that's where I would say it would become subjective. Now, the servant leader thing is To me, that's a great conversation because there are so many people who label themselves as a servant leader. And, somebody once asked a question in a meeting of a whole bunch of servant leaders: define what is a servant leader to you? And this was something where we were actually asked to put it in writing. What does it mean to you? And at the end, it wasn't shared who said what, but the answers were all shared. And there was not one single answer that was the same. And again, does it make them not a servant leader? Does it make them not a leader? No, absolutely not. I'm not going to disqualify that. But it does suggest to me that leadership is subjective based on what you need. So if you're the one defining it, Cullen, and you're out there looking for a specific thing, whatever's in your heart or whatever's on your task list, you may be looking at two different leaders to help you get where you need to be. It may still be one goal that you're trying to achieve, but there may not be a single source leader out there who brings all of that to the table. And that's where you would define leadership differently than everybody else. I don't know. That's a whole bunch of rambling. Does that make any sense to you?
Um, yeah, it does. I disagree with some of that. Is on one hand, you're taking kind of a follower perspective of, what leader do I need in order to achieve my goals? Um, and I really I like a lot of that, but that's not getting at what leadership is, right? That's looking for a leader to get you where you want to go. If you're looking at it from an organizational perspective, where it's, how do I train leaders? What is leadership, right? We're still bouncing around with, I'm looking for a leader to do this, or I'm looking for a leader to do that. Um, and yeah, I tend to buy into the situational, like how exactly you achieve leadership will depend on your situation and will depend on, um, you know, as we kind of said, leadership in NASA is going to look different than leadership in, for a sculptor, right? How does that look? But we're still trying to get at what that core is. And if that core is, you know, how do you inspire people? How do you put out your vision and inspire people to come into your vision and help you achieve that goal because it becomes their goal as well? Then we're talking about, leadership regardless of what field. And then like you alluded to in some of my posts, I tend to break this down into kind of three levels of hierarchy, where you've got the system level, like what is leadership? This kind of, and for me, I put that high definition, and then I put some three uh, really high level academic models, which would be trait based. Are you born a leader? Skills based. Is it based on the skill that you have? This is one that I tend to buy into a lot. Or behavior. Is leadership just something that you do? And if you replicate the behavior, you'll get the same results. Uh, like I said, I tend to think that it's much, as we've been talking, kind of situational, in which case the skills differ on what you need to be successful. And then you get the subsystem level that you touched on, um, my post before, which is kind of where does leadership kind of fit? What's the kind of general model? This would be like servant leadership, stuff like transformational leadership. Um, you know, some leadership theories are very kind of transactional. Others are more inspirational. Obviously, the way we've been talking, I tend to fall more into the transformational um, leadership model at this level. And then the post that I'm working on for today, didn't get out yet, is on the kind of component level. Is how do you manage those kind of day-to-day interactions and leadership style? A lot of these at this level like to use the word style, um, in order to inspire in a one-on-one interaction. Um, you know, recognizing what that person needs and how you can influence them. And I know that can be a loaded word for some, but if you're trying to help them reach their goals, you're trying to lead them into uh, getting done what needs to get done. And so that kind of stuff would be like Dan Goleman's styles of leadership. Um, let's see, I'm blanking on the other ones at the moment, of course, but that's one that I go to a lot.
I think that, so to the root of your question, how do you teach leadership? Well, if you were putting me on the spot to answer that question, here's how I would say it is you simply teach leadership by finding people who have a natural tendency to do the right thing, and whatever category they fall into, whether it's NASA, logistics, fast food restaurants, retail, whatever, you start off by teaching them the basics of the industry and whatever that entry level barrier is. So you're looking for a leader and they need to know this industry. So boom, here I'm going to teach you this. And then next, they're going to have people that report to them, or they've got a broken system that needs to be fixed. And so you have to give those foundations, those foundational levels of, um, here are the building blocks that we need. So we need integrity, we need honesty, we need hard work, we need uh, ingenuity. Um, you give those basics to somebody, and then you just have to set them free and let them say, okay, we've taught you how to be ethical. We've taught you how to understand the industry. We've taught you how to work with people. Um, from the, making sure people show up on time, making sure schedules are written. And that right there blurs the line, I think, between management and leadership because you're physically managing tasks. But I don't think that you can be a leader without being a manager at some point. So I think you have to be able to know how to run the business, whatever the business is, because I actually just had this conversation with somebody this week who said, to me, point blank said, you may not know these things about our industry, but you make up for it with your leadership skills and how you get people to do things when you're not around. And so I think that that's ultimately because if you think about it, it, when you're teaching someone how to be a leader, you've got to teach them those basic core competencies, which I will try to boil down real simple to say, be where you're supposed to be when you're supposed to be there. Do what you said you're going to do. Because a lot of being a leader is literally just showing up and having integrity and knowing what the mission is and making sure the mission is moving forward and making sure all the pieces are where they're supposed to be. But you can have two different people. For example, there's probably people that I think are amazing leaders who just are role models for leadership because they helped me accomplish a goal. But you could have at an organizational level a CEO who says, even though John thought they were an amazing leader, they didn't move the business forward. They didn't. They actually we went backwards in sales under that person. So they could be an amazing people leader, but not an amazing business leader. I don't know if I articulated that correctly.
Oh, I agree. So yeah, I mean, um, it and that would be kind of first of all, I agree. Management and leadership are intertwined. There's no there's no point where you get to this person's a pure leader or this person's a pure manager, and you need both of those skills. Like, I don't want to be taken as some of the memes where it's like this person is a leader and this person is a manager. A leader is everything good and a manager is everything. No, they're
Mhm.
both required. I've had amazing managers and I've had amazing leaders. But yeah, I also agree. Like from an individual standpoint, my goal may be to progress my career. And from a business standpoint, it may be to, increase sales in this industry. And somebody who's in between may be great at helping me advance and very poor at helping the overall the overall business in their vision. And yeah, I see no contradiction in that whatsoever. Um, and it's just what realm, right? You kind of have these. there's bubbles and kind of spheres of influence of where we agree, um, where we agree that these leadership kind of spheres of influence are, right. In a core team, it's they're trying to do this thing, and that may or may not fit the larger perspective, and that team may end up getting cut from the business, even though everybody's doing good work and the right thing. Hopefully, the business recognizes that and kind of redistributes them. But yeah, I don't disagree. It's you know, as I'm saying, there are all these different kind of models in leadership. And if it's not the right fit, it's not the right fit. It doesn't, no model guarantees that you're going to be a good leader. None of them. It's, here's a way to think about it. And from an organizational standpoint, you could then use the leadership styles that you want to teach throughout your organization as a way to kind of control the culture and build the culture that you want, right? Pull people in that share that vision. So hopefully you don't get the guy who's, a good people leader, but doesn't really buy into the company's vision.
Yeah. As you're talking, I was thinking about a story, and I think it can be applied here to the differences that we have just expressed. But there was an interview with a CEO, his executive team, and an outside executive coming in that was interviewing for a senior level executive role within the company, and the different philosophies sitting at the table. And just to lay it out, where from the CEO's perspective, he was looking to just bring in a strong leader with a good personality that was well-rounded, who could learn the business. The other executives at the table all had their own version of what they were looking for. The CFO wanted somebody who was 100% focused on P&L, just a good numbers person. You had the operations executives who were focused on safety and productivity only. And so they all had their own definition of what a great leader was and what they were looking for. And the interview actually came down to one question. They were all absolutely set on, okay, this is definitely the person. But they were trying to make sure that they had fleshed out their comfort level. One question was asked, and the answer given was by the candidate: I make mistakes every day. Sometimes I even say dumb things. The entire executive team backed away and said, no, we don't want that guy on our team. And the CEO said, literally, you're hired on the spot. And a debate ensues in this conversation. And the CEO says, if I had more people who are willing to admit that they made mistakes and admit that they weren't perfect, we wouldn't be looking to fill this role in the first place. And so it's interesting because you have, essentially the person in charge who's supposed to be setting the leadership tone, um, who, and the ultimate decision maker, of course, in the company. And then all of his leaders were so dead set on always being right and always being my way that they were just completely inflexible. So
Yep.
it's that pops in my mind a lot when I have these conversations about just how different. And in the room there were probably five or six different leaders with different opinions about what leadership looks like, how to define leadership, and what kind of leaders they wanted around them. Because in the end, none of the senior leaders were looking for the same person. They were all looking for somebody that they could tailor to suit their needs.
Yeah. So that brings up a couple of thoughts in my head. Is one, if they had, these are people whose primary job is leadership, and yet they don't have the vocabulary to talk to each other about, hey, this is what we're looking for, or there can be debates, of course, right? There's nobody saying this is to lock everybody into one mindset. No, uh, that's never going to happen. Or we still got people, but just having that vocabulary of, hey, this is kind of the model I'm looking at. This is the role that I see them filling. Um, and this is our culture and vision, um, is is important. And if they're sitting around there all having their own ideas and saying, well, we need somebody who does this, without that talk of, what is the leadership style that we're trying to do? What are we trying to achieve here? Uh, that's uh, they're just doing it on the fly, right? They're trying to reinvent the wheel in their own head, right? Everybody has a model of what leadership is in their head, and if you don't have the words, then it goes through some other filter. If you've got the words for it, you can have intelligent conversations about it, and at least have some trust that you're talking about the same thing. The other thing that you mentioned was, obviously making mistakes, and that's where, like, my background in creativity comes in, and innovations, right? Nobody, we tend to like to think of these kind of genius creators like, Steve Jobs was just sitting around one day and went, oh, iPhone, duh. And no, that's not what it is you got to process this out. You got to process innovation, right? Edison had a whole team where they just tried and failed and tried and failed and tried and failed, and they just kept making mistakes until they got the right ones in place. And, you know not being able to make mistakes would kill any of that type of innovation. um, and that kind of goes, again, kind of hand in hand with the leadership. Is A leadership is you're solving organizational problems, right? You're trying to get to a common goal, and you're trying to achieve that common goal, and what's standing in your way is everything that needs to happen to do that. Well, you're typically resource limited, you're constrained, in if you're doing engineering, you're often physically constrained. Physics only works so many ways. Um, and that is a creative problem that you have to solve. And if you're trying to run this as, I'm never going to make any mistakes, 1 + 1 = 2 and always equals 2, uh, then you're never going to get innovation. It just won't happen. Um, you may get some incremental improvements along the way, but you're never going to get that kind of step change that, a lot of these leaders would say that they want, right? Just look along LinkedIn post. Everybody wants innovation, but nobody wants the uncomfort of dealing with the failures and the schedule slips and all that in order to achieve it. Um, and you got to kind of mesh these two, and that's, again, some of what I try to talk about is, here's some creativity models and here's some leadership models, and let's start bringing them together, so that we can kind of process in creativity and understand what it takes to really get to those innovations. Obviously, my perspective is from a very engineering one. That's where I've spent my career, but I do think that it's largely applicable, having spent time in systems work. So I have done some logistics stuff, but it's yeah, it's a mess, and it's beautiful because of it.
Colin, here's why I'm smiling and laughing is I actually have a degree in sociology, and so um, even though I'm in logistics, I've studied people for 30 years. And so what I laugh about is I get it. And that's why I was really looking forward to this conversation because from an engineering perspective, there's very specific ways things should be done. And that's what really intrigued me about your questions. And I'm what I'm really curious about is um, when I don't believe that you're just out there asking questions because you're curious about other people's opinions. And so, well, I think you are curious about their opinions, but I also think you have some pretty strong opinions about it as well. And that's what intrigued me about this conversation. And that's what I'm looking for is that nugget of gold of if Colin ruled the world, how would this look? What would the rules be on leadership?
Uh, well, I'm not sure about rules, but the way that I would teach people is, right. One of the things that gets said a lot, that really bugs me, is, you get leadership posts being like, hey, I'm not the smartest person in the room. I hire the smartest people in the room. And that, from a skills perspective, that always bugs me because I want the leader to be the smartest leader in the room. They don't have to be the smartest engineer. I can do that, right? It, but that's leadership is a skill set. It's a separate skill set. If I would have people learn, uh, you know, early on, I would have them learn some of these like component level style, very prescriptive models of leadership and kind of a basic definition. Um, I personally like Peter Nordhaus's uh, definition, where leadership is a process whereby an individual influences a group of individuals to achieve a common goal. Like that, to me, I haven't found anything that people would generally qualify as leadership that doesn't fit into that definition. Um, and so that's where it gives a word, it gives a way to talk about it. It gives a way to deal with it. And as you get people moving into that leadership management role, where it's heavy on management, but they are still leading, having those type of prescriptive models gives basically kind of training wheels. They fall apart in more complex problems, but for simpler problems, stuff like the situational leadership, the SL2 model, will say, hey, look at it. This is how you assess, this person in this task, and this is the leadership style you should deal with in order to help them through it, in order to accomplish the goal. Uh, you know, that gives people a start at the vocabulary and a mental framework to build off of. And then as you get into more senior roles, you go into kind of that subsystem level where it's okay, now let's talk about a broader framework. From an organizational standpoint, they could say, hey, this is the one that we use. This is what we push here, and this is why. Reinforcing the kind of vision and values uh, that they've put in writing somewhere, uh, that some people really live by, and some people say, oh, well, we need a mission statement, we need a vision statement. Here it is. Um, and being able to do that authentically because they have an idea of what that model looks like. And then uh, again, as you get higher up, you can start thinking about, hey, how do we feel? Like, I will always be a skills person. I think it boils down to skills, but they can start looking at what skills do we think are just absolutely necessary in our industry, in our company, in order to be a leader, right? It's, the skills models don't say these are the exact skills. It's one of the things that a lot of people see as a weakness of those models, but I think it's one of the strengths. It's just people try to do it at that prescriptive level, and it's not. It's a higher level, you know, figure out what skills you need to be successful. And so in my world, you train the leadership skills as you develop. It's not just um, hey, you're a manager now, figure it out, get this stuff done. Um, or hey, now you're moving up. I I guess I'll say this. I've got a lot of friends who are making that jump now. Um, and it's problematic because they were good at engineering and now they're in management. The two are not fundamentally related. Yeah, you probably need the engineering skills so you can talk to other engineers in the group, but they don't necessarily have any management or leadership skills, and they're just kind of promoted until they fail with no understanding of why they're failing at these levels. And I would maintain a lot of it is because they don't have the leadership skills. They're failing because we're not training an entire skill set that's necessary for their job.
I don't disagree with anything that you've said. I just want to put that out there. Um, and quite frankly, I think the way you've described it, I think universally that's how it works because that's been my experience in three different industries. It has been exactly as you describe it when it's done right. I've seen it done way wrong as well. And so I'm probably a little bit biased because the way you describe it is the way I understand it. One thing, I think your clarity on the statement about, when someone says, the leader puts the smartest people in the room, I think your clarity on that is important because, um, here's where I think it can go wrong. I agree with the way you worded it to say the best leader in the room puts the right people on the right projects or whatever, whatever it is you're trying to solve. I think that's the right way to word it. Where I get concerned, where groupthink can start to creep in, is if you've got the wrong leader, maybe they're the smartest leader, but if they're not the right leader, they could squash the best ideas. And that's where I worry from time to time as I go in to evaluate teams and make assessments over do I have the right people in the right roles? What I do is I try to look to find who is the most collaborative leader, and if they aren't the best leader, can I help them improve that? Can the team help them improve that? But um, I have a career as a problem solver. Unfortunately, I spent way too many years solving other people's problems, and so that's why I look at it the way I look at it is I might have the best leader, but he may also be the biggest jerk. And if it's not his idea, it's not the right idea, and that never flies with me. Only because two reasons: I have been that guy, and I have killed a team because of it, and then I have worked for that guy who killed our team because of it. And so I've learned, unfortunately, the hard way that um, I think the way you worded it is the way it needs to be worded, and maybe we should work on making that the popular quote. Um, I make all my own memes that I share, so I'll work on making that meme with your name underneath it.
Yeah, I mean, so let me put my I've generally been talking from my leadership hat. Let me put my creativity hat on a little bit. Is one of the things you said is kind of necessary for leaders is ingenuity, and you know part of that is you have to creatively solve problems. There's been a lot of study. Most people don't realize this, but I actually have a degree in creativity and change leadership. Um, at a master's or I've got the graduate certificate. So I was working towards my master's. I'm taking a break at the moment, but it's looking at uh, the psychological studies of creativity tools. How do we come up with new ideas? How do we are there processes that can make that happen? And one of the things about this is you give the leaders the leadership model so that they can kind of intentionally choose their leadership style, but then you can also give them these creativity tools and train them in the skills of creativity that allows them to back off, right? Allows them to not necessarily be right. I've got strong opinions, but if you convince me I'm wrong, I will be just as strong for the opinions that I've been convinced into. Um, and to adding this type of ability to be uncertain, these divergent thinking models of hey, we're just going to throw ideas out there, and then we're going to build on the best pieces of all of them, allows it to be much more collaborative, and it's process that then develops the creativity skills. And if you have a leader who's comfortable with their role in the team, um, and also trained in in that type of creative facilitation, uh, you're gonna lose a lot of that. Uh, I need to be right. Um, it's I can passionately argue for my ideas, but you can convince me I'm wrong, and that's kind of the level that I think happens when you start training people, uh, to be creative, because the leader should needs to remember that everyone's there trying to solve the same problem, right? Kind of by definition of leadership, we're trying to meet a common goal. Nobody's going in going, hey, I'm going to sabotage this meeting and make sure that everything goes wrong. If they are, get rid of that person. But nobody's going in there going, hey, I want to have a bad day at work today. It's so giving people the processes and the models and the training that they need to succeed is part of a leader's responsibility and part of an organizational's uh, broader responsibility for how they want to operate. And yeah, I've had jerk leaders and I've seen them destroy teams, and it's because they have to, like you said, they have to be right. Well, if you remove that and give them a process to solve the problem where they don't have to be right, because that's a lot of stress on a leader. You always have to be right when you're not the smartest person in the room. I can't imagine. Um, let's again just keep reframing it as, how do we solve this problem? Hey, this is more complex. Can we take this piece of this idea with this piece of this idea and come to a solution that works everywhere? And not everybody's going to be happy with the trade-offs you make, but if everybody's kind of part of that process on the team, and even if the leader has to say, hey, we're 50-50, I just have a feeling for this one and I'm breaking the tie so we can move forward. Everybody knows that it's part of the process. It's that secondary idea is now option B that we already have some work towards if option A fails, right?
Yeah, so you said something else there that I think needs to be a quote. You said, I can passionately argue my opinions, but you can convince me I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Um,
And then I'll
which,
be just as passionate for the opinion I've been convinced into.
well, here's the thing, Colin, is if more leaders thought like that, we probably wouldn't even be having this conversation about what defines a leader. How do you teach a leader? Because I think that that is part of what makes a good leader, or part of how you train a leader is they've got to be able to be convinced that their idea might not be the best one. Now, and here's I think why there's that undercurrent of I'm trying to use beach terms since you're at a beach house. Um, because the standard society defined leader is someone who's a strong leader, someone who is, we're going to get this done, we're committed. And you don't want a wishy-washy leader who's going to go in and say, well, what does everybody else think? And okay, that's what we'll do. But I think that the key word there is you'll passionately argue your opinion until you're convinced you're wrong. And I think that that is the important part is, and that's what I look for on a team is when we get on calls or we get into a room, we start talking through things, the people who are sharing no opinion at all, that are not stepping up, those are the ones I worry about. Because what I start to think to myself is, I think I'm wasting a seat right there because I'm not getting any feedback. I'm not getting any participation from that person. And they've got to have an opinion. Why are they even in this room if they just agree with everything everybody else is saying? And sometimes I do. There are times where I have surrounded myself with so many like-minded people that we'll get in there and we'll create the best idea. We'll come up with something that wins. And I will step back and say, this is a strong team because not one person disagreed. In fact, everybody said yes and that's one of the leadership qualities that I teach is leadership by improv. Of you, when you get in there to solve a problem, you can't say no and you can't crap on somebody's idea. It's yes and because that says you heard them and I'm going to help make that idea better. Um, so yeah, anyway, I could probably go off on a tangent on participation alone, but I think that that's a part of what makes a strong leader is that they've brought the room together and the room actively participates in making the whatever we're trying to do better.
Yeah, so actually, this gets into the kind of creativity stuff. Is everybody knows the term brainstorming. Most people don't actually know the tool of brainstorming. I was reading a post the other day where people were talking about, oh, brainstorming is just this unstructured thing. No, it's not. In creativity, there's a very defined set. It's specifically, most people go, oh, we'll sit down, I'll shoot out an idea, somebody else will tell me what's wrong with it, and we'll just kind of shoot ideas out until we run out of time or come up with something that seems to work well enough. The actual uh, brainstorming tool was developed by Alex Osborne out of Buffalo State College, which is where I did my creativity studies. And so like brainstorming is specifically a divergent tool. It's about getting as many ideas out there as possible. And so like there are certain principles of like you know putting as many ideas out there as possible, deferring judgment, trying to build off of other people's ideas, very similar to kind of yes um and then going for novelty is go for the really out there ideas because it's always easier to kind of tame an idea than add some innovation to a relatively minor idea, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It makes sense to me. So that I thank you for that explanation because I think that you're right. There's probably millions of people who think brainstorming is just an excuse to get in a room and talk about ideas without actually having a structure for how to solve a problem.
Yeah, and here's the thing, it's brainstorming is also just the first part of that process, right? It's strictly about diverging. How do I come up with as many ideas to choose from and build off of as possible? You should not come out of a brainstorming session with that is the answer. It should be here's all of this stuff, and then there are converging tools where you take all of these and you say, uh, one of the ones that uh, I particularly think about is appreciative judgment. Is you look at each idea and you say, hey, what do I like? Somebody came up with that idea. Their brain came up with that idea to solve the problem for some reason. It may not be the best ever, but there's some aspect of it that seems to solve the problem to somebody's brain. And so trying to get all of those pieces out then allows you to assemble what may be the final solution or several possible final solutions. And then, like I said, uh, it, especially in engineering, we go down a path, we think we're right, and sometimes we just hit a physics block. You can't get past it. Physics doesn't work that way. And so you need to have an option B, C, D, and however many that you need. And doing brainstorming correctly gives you a backbench of all of that stuff that you just don't have if you sit down and go, oh, well, this is where we're going. Right? We're going to shoot down ideas until we can't shoot one down or we run out of time, and that's the best one we got. But that's where these creativity processes, right? It's a creative process isn't going to get you to the final solution. There are creative skills that you have to develop, but a creative process can give the avenue for creative people and creatively trained people to get to innovative solutions.
I like the way you explained that, and I think the part that might catch some people is the part about, because I, I think that people have gone into a room, and the way you explained it is, you talk about ideas until, you essentially you're canceling them all out. You're just working through that process. That to me, I think is an interesting way to look at it that until you said it, I've never thought about it like that.
That's how a lot of brainstorming sessions that I deal with operate, and that's not how the tool actually works. So
Yeah,
if you've never ended up there, consider yourself lucky.
when you do lean and Kaizen events, they talk about the parking lot and where you throw things, you throw ideas that we just don't have the time or resources to talk about right now. And I like the way you explained it better. Because I think what it does is it adds validity to the idea that was brought up by the person in the room versus just saying, okay, good idea, but some other date. And I'm sure you have the same types of issues on meetings that you have, but um, when someone says, let's talk about that offline, 99% of the time, that's a way of saying, I don't want to talk about that right now. They're not actually going to set a meeting to come talk to you about
Yeah,
that. They're not going to call you later. Um, it's just a way of
a
saying,
polite way to kill it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So this has been in my own opinion, a great conversation. I've enjoyed this back and forth. I'm glad that we chose to do it this way versus the back and forth on LinkedIn, because so much can be lost through text
Right.
messaging or comments. Colin, I'm curious. Would you be interested in continuing this conversation on a panel discussion with some other leaders from different industries?
Sure, I'm happy to. I enjoy these type of conversations. Obviously, I'm on vacation, and this is what I'm choosing to do with my morning. So,
Yeah, I appreciate that. So
uh,
what I'll do is there's a couple folks that I think would enjoy this discussion from just completely different industries, however, focusing on the same thing, focusing on how do you teach and develop culture and then nurture the leadership. And I'll try to get that on the schedule within the next week.
okay. One tidbit that I'll leave you with that we haven't really touched on is, but the definitions of leaders that I use and the models that I use do not require somebody to be in a management or leadership role. And I use them regularly from an individual contributor role and lead as more of a technical expert. Right? I don't have a group of people under me, but I influence the group that I work with. Uh, knowing these models, knowing these skills, uh, and how to interact. So it's not strictly relevant to people in the C-suite. It's anybody can use these kind of things to try to put forward their vision and get people to buy in.
I absolutely agree. I think leadership is a lifestyle. It's not a title. And I, for a while, I took almost a 2 year break from having actual people report to me, and it was probably the greatest period of growth for me personally as a leader. Of I'm not anybody's boss, but yet I still have a mission that I have to accomplish, and I think that human leadership should be a lifestyle.
Great.
So I'll try to work that into a quote. So, so
If it didn't happen this time, we can try next time.
yeah. So if you're still watching, I want to thank you for watching. Obviously, I'd love it if you'd subscribe to the YouTube channel. Cullen's contact information will be in the comments section of this video and in the comments wherever this video is shared. And if we've said something today that has pissed you off, made you happy, made you curious, throw some comments out there, put yourself into the conversation. I think I'll speak for Cullen when I'll say we'll invite you back to have a conversation, and maybe you can passionately argue your point and convince Cullen that you're right. So thanks again for watching. Thanks for following. And I hope you have a great day.